Word to the computer.
Hi, and this is Leticia, your Spanish interpreter. I think we got things figured out.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we'll start the webinar. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Folks coming in, I see you there. Welcome to our meeting tonight. This is the second Independent District Commission meeting. Today is Wednesday, March 1st, and we'll be here from 6 to 8:30. Before we get started, I'll pass it over to Adam to go over some Zoom meeting logistics.
Can you guys add me as the interpreter? Thank you.
Oops, sorry. Hey everyone, I'm Adam Briggs. I'm with the City of Portland, and I'm going to go over the Zoom logistics real quick for everybody. This meeting is being recorded for later viewing. A copy of the recording will be posted on the Independent District Commission meeting page under past meetings and events. For today's meetings, we have closed captioning, ASL, and Spanish interpretation available. To access Spanish interpretation, you just click on the globe icon at the bottom right of your screen and select Spanish. To access closed captioning, click on the CC button on the bottom right side of your screen, and then the ASL interpreters are our panelists. Commissioners, please set your chat settings to everyone so folks listening can follow along. And community members listening in, we have the Zoom Q&A feature available tonight. Feel free to submit questions or comments through there. We may be able to answer those questions today, but they will become part of the meeting record if we don't get to them. We have a pretty tight schedule tonight. At today's meeting, we won't be taking verbal public comment, but you can submit public comments through our comment form online on our website or by emailing districtcommission@portlandoregon.gov. Be on the lookout for future public comment opportunities on our website.
Thank you.
Now,
oh, go ahead.
Perfect. And I was just going to jump in and say thank you, Adam. And my name is Autumn Carter. I'll be the facilitator for the commission this evening. We'll walk through the agenda just to give an overview. So we will start with commission business, including adopting meeting minutes from the most recent meeting on the 15th, voting on the rotating chair format and to the initial 2 co-chairs that would serve, reviewing the commission work plan, and allowing time at the end of commission business to allow commissioners to reflect on comments they've received, official comments and official comments that they've received in recent weeks. From there, we'll move on to reviewing the commission's founding documents, specifically refining and moving to a vote if ready for the bylaws and working agreements. We'll have an update on work completed by the community engagement work group, specifically on the community engagement framework, the values, and starting an initial discussion around the public hearing plans. We'll have at 7:10, we'll have a presentation from Flow Analytics and Redistricting Partners around district criteria. And that will include a discussion among the commissioners. We'll close with next steps and adjourning the meeting at 8:30. Okay. And any questions or items in terms of the agenda? If not, we'll move on to commission business. Perfect. So, and actually this is not on the formal agenda, but I did want to note that we have Maya Haim from the city attorney's office joining the call for the first half hour, 30 minutes or so. And so if commissioners have questions for the city attorney, we probably won't have time to do one by one question and answer. However, we can use the chat function. And we may be able to have the city attorney provide a response in real time, but there may also just be, this may be an opportunity to compile questions that require further review and follow up. So just wanted to note that. Don't forget about the chat function. Okay, we'll move on to vote on the meeting minutes, which have been made available on the commission website. And these are meeting minutes again from the 15th. Are there any motions to adjust, to revise the meetings as they exist? And if not, are we ready to move to a vote to adopt them as is? Okay. So seeing no motions to revise. And I'll let the screen share. So just as a reminder for the way consensus voting will work, if there is general consensus, we'll move on without a roll call vote. However, if there is opposition to the adoption, I saw no opposition to revisions, there's no opposition to adoption, we'll just adopt. And this will be how we move decisions forward in the future as well. So is there consensus on approving the minutes from the 15th? Okay. Seeing no opposition, we'll know that those are approved. Okay, and so we'll move on to the second item, which is the election of co-chairs. So we have nominations available from Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins and Commissioner Saxena, who would serve in rotating chairs extending through April 2023. I will run down the list of responsibilities so that everyone is aware of what the roles entails. These are also included in the bylaws that we'll be discussing later. So in short, co-chairs will be responsible for supporting the facilitator's role in leading discussions and keeping the commission on track in terms of task and time. They will collaborate with both staff and the facilitator around meeting agendas, provide guidance on content, and that includes providing ideas to meet the goals of the IDC. They will establish the formal, they will establish the formal time limits for testimony by members of the public. And to note, we won't have public comment in this meeting, but there will be opportunities for public comment in future meetings. They'll provide direction to staff in preparation for public meetings, provide feedback to staff as well on a variety of issues, participate fully and equally as a member of the IDC, encourage modified consensus decision-making, which you just ran through. They'll also be able to lead meetings when all attempts at reaching consensus have been exhausted. And finally, they can and be designated to serve as a spokesperson for the IDC. Okay. And are there any questions around the role of co-chair before we move to the first vote?
One quick question, is this through April 1st or is this through May 1st?
So this would be through April 30th. Did I get that right?
The end of April.
The end of April, that's correct.
I see. I thought we were having monthly co-chairs. It's bi-monthly?
The bylaws call for, the draft bylaws as they exist, call for bi-monthly or every 2 months, 2 rotating co-chairs, which depending on the way the calendar works out, that should give everyone the opportunity, that should give the full commission the opportunity to serve as co-chairs if that's desired.
Great. What's our next step? Does someone need to make a motion and then we second it? Is that what we do?
If you'd like to make a motion, I can technically move to the vote, but we can also take motions. So
I move that we approve Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins and Commissioner Saxena as our co-chairs.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I second.
Thank you. I think that was Commissioner Maharas came in first. I saw that correctly as the formal second. All right. So again, we'll use modified consensus here. Is there any opposition to one or both of the nominees? Seeing none, we have to approve co-chairs. Congratulations to Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins and Commissioner Saxena. We will connect with you afterward around collaborating and coordinating with staff and the facilitators for this. So thank you for serving in the position for the first go around. Okay. We're ready to move to the work. Thanks, Adam. So there is a lot of text on this slide. But in this document, you've seen a version of it before, but we did actually want to just, as a group, work through the timeline, talk it through, and then see if there are any issues or concerns around timing or specific steps that potentially should be included. So start with the focus, and these are, broadly speaking, they are in months. Some of the items may potentially extend in, but they are generally focused on the months that they'll broadly happen. So starting at the top, of course, we are past January in terms of the appointment and initial onboarding, and kind of have been undertaking the foundational work and development of the draft plan criteria in February. This is going to continue into March as well, with the release of the draft plan for the criteria, as well as the public hearing. So I'm just going to take the first order here. In terms of community engagement, this aspect is still being fleshed out, and this will be reflected, some of the detail in this will be reflected in the work plan, the community engagement work plan. And that will also be informed by the community engagement framework, which we'll review later. So public comment has already opened. The contractor around community engagement has been, a notice of intent has been issued. However, that is not formal. A formal contract around the community engagement has not been formally contracted. In March, this is where we'll have us, so including the work sessions, we're calling these meetings work sessions formally in the record. However, there will also be public hearings that include comment and a vote. There's a public meeting, a meeting with public comment, as it's not considered a work session at that point. So that'll be on the 13th. The official public comment will open on the 15th, and then we'll have that hearing. So the comment period and the hearing are tied together. And again, in that hearing, this is where you will have released your draft criteria plan and hold the public hearing on it. And then the comment around the plan specifically will close on the 29th. Moving on to April. That's when the actual vote, having had the public hearing and receiving public comment and reviewing that and revising the plan, voting on the plan will begin. That's also our voting on the plan will lead to drafting the maps. The criteria, as we heard in the last meeting, and we'll learn more about today, those are directly tied, the criteria and the maps. Drafting the maps will continue into April, and in June, releasing the draft district plan. So again, those will include a series of work sessions that are aligned with all of those deliverables, as well as potentially subcommittees that will do some of that work in between, and opportunities for comment and any other initiatives that are part of the community engagement work plan. Finally, we'll move to July through August and September. So July is when the 8 meetings are concentrated. So these are required under measure 26-228. There's a specific time frame in which they need to happen so that they coincide both with having time to review the plan, but also having time ahead of the vote itself, which you'll need to take in August. As a reminder, this commission has 2 opportunities to vote on adopting the plan. If it cannot do so, the plan will go to the most recent plan that you vote on, will go to the council for their consideration and adoption. There will be a series of work sessions in August, and then the period for public information, and the approach to that will be determined. So the public information period in September ahead of following the vote, but focused on informing around the implications, that will be focused around September, and how that approach is undertaken should be defined by this body. So that's the overview. That is the timeline. Those are, and should say, these are the things that have to happen, right? They're cornerstones, they are pillars, but they are not the only activities that need to happen. That is for this body, this commission, to really define how you want to approach actually implementing and approaching these milestones as they align with the requirements under measure 26-228.
Can I ask a quick question about the public hearing on March 22nd?
Yes.
there's no time frame on this. Actually, I was looking at the information that was sent earlier. It says March 20th for a public hearing. And then this sheet says March 22nd. So I just want to verify the date and also the time.
I believe this is the most recent version in terms of scheduling. So it's March 22nd.
Hola, buenas tardes. ¿Alguien está aquí en la plática de español que le ocupe interpretación? Por favor, díganme algo, digan que sí.
So what time are we expected to participate in this hearing and what time would it be?
Yeah, so the time that we found through our engagement with the Charter Commission that's worked best for community is the evening. So 6 to 8 is the time that I was suggesting for the public hearing. And we would love it for all of you to join our public hearing. Of course, I think it's understandable if you can't. That's why we'll have a recording of the hearing. So you all can go back and watch it. And of course, we know that this date might not work for all community members. So that's why we have a 2-week comment period for folks to come and give input. So that will be available online. So if folks can't join the public hearing on the 22nd, they can watch the recording online and from the presentation that we would give and give public comment in other ways.
Thank you. I'm assuming Zoom, but thank you.
So that is a direction or decision that the commission can make around primarily a virtual meeting. There can be accommodations to make for an in-person viewing if that's how you want to approach it, a hybrid situation. There is room to decide how to approach this, how to approach the public hearings.
I have a question about the
Sure.
district plan criteria. Does the charter amendment that created our commission, does it obligate us to vote on district plan criteria? I'm thinking here about the feedback we received in the public comment from the League of Women Voters, in which they encouraged us to not create criteria that went beyond the statutory requirement. Is there a reason we have to vote on the criteria that goes beyond the statutory, or is this an optional step?
You do have to vote on the criteria. However, you do not have to vote to add additional criteria. So if the commission chooses to use the criteria that are required under measure 262228, then you have to vote to approve that decision. If you choose to go beyond it, you also have to vote on that and approve those as well.
Thank you.
Of course.
Can you elaborate on that? In terms of
Commissioner Menez.
the additional, I looked for a hand raise. I didn't see it on my computer, so I apologize if I'm interrupting, but can you elaborate on voting on the additional criteria versus the criteria that's in the charter?
So, yes, I can. I just want to make sure I'm tying together the two presentations. So there was some discussion around this in the last presentation. There will be another presentation later in the evening around criteria. The commission has the ability to consider other factors, other data, other information, but they do not necessarily need to be used as criteria to define the maps. And I'll also yield to Sophia as well, who has her hand up.
I was just going to say that our city attorney is here, so she could probably speak better to us. Maya?
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. So there are certain criteria that are set out in state and federal law that you must abide by, and those are set out in the charter. The Charter Commission added one criteria in addition to those set out in state and federal law, and that's that the districts be compact. And this commission can take those criteria, decide to add to them, or leave them as they are. So it's really up to your discretion. You have a floor that you must consider, and you can add to that if you wish, but you do not have to.
Is there a definition of compact?
There is not a definition of compact. And so what that it'll default to what's in the Webster's dictionary, and the idea behind that was really that they not be, if you think about a gerrymandered district that's quite elaborately drawn and goes through, it's very, very skinny, then that would not be a compact district. So contiguous and compact are what the charter requires.
Well, and I just respectfully, to the best, well, my reading of the charter is that to the extent that it's possible, as far as the contiguous thing, it's not, that is not, there's some ambiguity and room for discussion about what that means as far as what's best for Portland in the long run.
Right, I mean, in short, we basically have all these criteria and they're gonna come into conflict. And so then our job is to weigh them against each other, right?
And there will be, and also I will say that at least for this portion of the discussion, it might be best to also have this after and in conjunction with Flo's presentation later in the evening, just so that, we're all hearing the same thing and you'll be able to ask questions there as well. Unless there are specific or more legal oriented questions while the city attorney is with us. Okay. And Sophia, is that a raised hand or?
It's a new one. Sorry, I think Maya wanted to speak on two different things. One of it was conflict of interest that one of you brought up last time. I think it was you, Commissioner Chisholm, and I think something else. So I'll just give it back to Maya.
Yeah, so I just wanted to quickly drop in, Sophia had forwarded two questions for me. And the first one was, what is the definition of conflict of interest? And the definition is found in state law. And the reason that that applies to you is by virtue of your participation on this commission, you are a public official, just like I am, because I work for the city, I'm a city employee. So employees, volunteers like you, elected officials, we are all public officials. And we are statutorily required to comply with the statutory ethics. One of those statutes is conflicts of interest. And the conflict of interest statute is really exclusively interested in money. So if you are in a position as a commissioner to make a decision or a recommendation that's either going to impact your financial situation in a positive way or in a negative way, either you or somebody in your family or a cousin, then you have a potential conflict of interest. It's hard for me to think of a set of facts that this might give rise to in the work that you're going to be doing. The most concrete example that helps make this real is if you are the bureau director for our internal administrative services bureau, and we need to get new carpet in City Hall, and you are the person who is going to be deciding who gets that contract, and your sister has a carpet company, you automatically have a potential conflict of interest because your sister might bid for that contract. And you would have to announce that at the beginning of a meeting that you have a potential conflict of interest. It has not yet ripened into an actual conflict of interest. Once the bid or the RFP, as we call it at the city, goes out to the public, and if your sister then bid and submitted on that contract, you would have an actual conflict of interest. That's really different from the facts you guys will be presented with. I use it only because it's a nice concrete example. And I will send to Sophia tomorrow a nice packet that the Secretary of State and the Ethics Commission has put together that really walks through all of the different statutory ethics with some great examples. Again, I think that because what you're doing is more abstract, critical for the city, but not really delving into financial aspects, I don't think this will come up for you. But if you have any questions about it, or if a fact pattern arises later and you have questions, please reach out to Sophia and I will work with her to get that answer to you. So you're not alone. I'm here to help. So any questions about that before I move on to the second question? I know that was, the 30-second high-level view of what can be a complicated legal issue.
I had a conflict of interest question. I'm not trying to make waves, but my understanding is the city attorney represents the mayor and the city council. And I don't know how we're gonna end up here, but there may be some issues where the commission is at odds with the city council and the mayor. And I raised this the last meeting. I would like to have an elections lawyer who's not associated with the city, at least as someone that we can consult with along the way, where we feel that we have a safe and confidential voice to ask questions that we may not be comfortable doing so under the umbrella of the city.
Well, like my office represents the city as a whole. And I'm not sure, we can certainly talk about that later if you have fact patterns that come up. But I'm struggling to think of something that would put you directly at odds with any of the electeds, because they will be bound by the decisions you make. So do you have any particular instance in mind or something like that you can help flesh out that parade of horribles for me?
I mean, just speaking in generalities, I mean, there are people on the city council currently who will be running for city council in this next election. And I think there should be some separation. I mean, we're called the Independent Districting Commission. And I guess my understanding was that in taking on this assignment, we would have experts and consultants at our disposal who we thought would be appropriate to advise us along this realm. And why risk it? I mean, I guess that's my big picture, is like, let's have some separation and some autonomy so that our group and the people the mayor appointed can do what we were appointed to do.
Thank you. I appreciate the candor, and I will definitely bring it back to the city attorney and see what his thoughts are.
Thank you.
And I'm not sure if it's my role to call on anyone, but Commissioner
That was
Baldini, I see your hand is up.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to second Commissioner Van Ness's concern. It's part of my job in my real life to study electoral reform, and the more distance our group can have from the council that will be elected by these rules, the better for the legitimacy of our decision and for the process as a whole. So I just wanted to echo that. Thank you.
And Commissioner Manhattan?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the discussion. And I think it's absolutely worth continuing to keep on the table in the discussion. I do want to put this in the context of the budget. And I know that this came up last time. So part of it is we have sort of a time limited charge, and we have a specific set of resources that were allocated. So I wouldn't want to prioritize having separate conversation with council on issues that maybe don't need that level of distance. So again, I want to break it apart to say there are some questions that the city attorney can answer that are general questions about election law that would help us in making an informed decision. And then there's other questions, that maybe we feel like might be informed by or have a conflict given the relationship with the city attorney and the city. I'm struggling also to figure out what the distinction there would be. That doesn't mean they don't exist, right? So I think something could come up, but I do want us, as we're moving through this conversation, to make sure that with the limited resources we do have, we prioritize the community engagement and the communication that's actually going to be required to make this process as transparent and as accessible as possible. So as we have to make decisions about how we allocate resources, I don't want to have a whole line item that goes to an attorney that's sort of set aside to sit through these meetings, rather than have some of the community engagement opportunities that I know are going to be necessary for things like translation, accessibility, et cetera. So I think that's part of our internal decision making that's going to need to happen. So if we can just bring back sort of that piece around the budget and what's going to be needed to make sure that the whole process is accessible and take this particular piece into consideration, I think that would be really helpful. But also as an attorney, I think having somebody just here sitting on an hourly basis, having to be on call for questions can be really costly. And I want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about that.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Attorney Hyam will be following up with the office as well. Commissioner Lumley, if you're going to weigh in on this item, can we keep it pretty tight? I know that Attorney Hyam does
Yeah.
have to leave.
Sure. I just wanted to say I appreciate the concern and also seek the balance that Commissioner Manhabar is recommending. Perhaps at a later date, we can have a conversation about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate to have the city attorney cover for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Attorney Hyam, do you have time to answer to address the second item, or do we need to follow
I
up?
do, and I think it's a very
Okay.
discrete issue. And the second question that was posed was really how much wiggle room or discretion is there when we're talking about the equal population as nearly as practicable. And I looked at some of the information that you'd already been given by, I believe it's Flow Analytics. And I agree with that probably anything 5% to 10% of a deviation is going to be in the yellow. Anything 5% and below is going to be safe. And I took a look at Eugene because they do wards. They have 8 or 9, I can't remember, but they have a process that they use where they take the population of Eugene, divide it by the number of wards they have, then say, okay, this is roughly what we want in each of our districts. Then they say, and I've looked in 2001, they adopted criteria that said, we want a plus or minus 5%. So right at the top of that safe ceiling. 10 years after that, in 2011, they decreased that from 5% to a 3% deviation. And most recently in 2021, they halved that again. So now their most recent redistribution of districting is, I think the closest gap they've got is about 1.5%. So you can certainly adopt criteria like that if you like, but I think 5% or below, it would really be the most conservative deviation for that population figure. Does anyone have a follow-up question?
Do you know why they've been dropping it over time?
I don't know. I can reach out to see if they've got any insight into that. It might just be that 5% was their identified criteria, and in reality, they were actually always pretty lower than that. And then they've just, because they were lower than that, they've been not artificially, but they've been decreasing that deviation in their adopted criteria. So I don't know, but they've never been either an adopted criteria or an actual practice above a deviation of 5%.
Well, certainly the technology has gotten better over the last 20 years as well,
Yes.
making it possible to do this. Yeah.
All right, with that, I'm
Thank
gonna step out of the meeting. I'll just say briefly, I really value the work that you guys are doing as volunteers. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing what our government looks like in the next few years. So thank you for your service. Bye.
Thank you. Okay. And we will be able to, and we will have other opportunities, of course, to consult with the attorney, and we'll also be following up on that question around external counsel. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is to review. So to review the versions of the bylaws, the draft versions of the bylaws and the working agreements, which do not have updated any red line changes from what you've seen before. And they have been made available on the commission's website as well. So to approach this, we're going to take the documents one at a time. We'll start with bylaws and then we'll go to working agreements. And assuming that everyone has had a chance to review the bylaws over the last several weeks, are there any proposals for amending the bylaws? Or are there any proposals to discuss elements of the bylaws as they are today? And Sophia has actually, and just for reference, Sophia has dropped a link to the final documents as well in the chat. Okay. So seeing, I don't see any indicators that anyone has any proposed revisions. So are we good to adopt, to move for voting to adopt? And we can do this with modified consensus as well. Commissioner Manaras.
I'll motion to adopt.
And do I have a second?
This is Paul, I second.
Thank you. Okay. And if I see opposition, we'll go to a roll call vote, and if not, we will adopt them. All right, congratulations. Order of business complete. You have bylaws, and we'll reference them as items come up for process purposes. Just to note, just a reminder, there are also opportunities to amend all of the documents as the commission progresses. So you will have opportunities to propose revisions if you would like down the line. Okay, so we'll move to the working agreements, and perfect. That link has also been dropped in the chat as well. That has not changed from a version you've seen probably several times now. Okay, so we'll start with the same, we'll use the same process. This one, are there any points that any commissioners would like to discuss or proposals for amendments? And Commissioner Lumley, are you off mic too? Oh, okay. Wasn't sure, I was like, yeah, jumping in or not. Okay. Okay. And Commissioner Hanson.
Yeah, I had one suggestion on the very last point on the working agreements that we're looking at, number 11, use I statements. I was going to suggest something like speak from your own experience and expertise to be a little bit more specific about what we mean, what I am assuming we mean by the intention to use I statements.
Okay. And actually, thank you, Commissioner. I'm actually going to ask Adam, can I screen share the document just so we're actually looking at the same text? This document is pretty short, so hopefully the screen share isn't too intense. Okay, give me 1 second. So this is the working agreements document. So the last, and I'll scroll to the bottom here. The last statement, Commissioner, you proposed something more of like
The suggestion was speak from your experience and expertise. For example, I think the interaction we just had with the city attorney's representative was a great example of a couple of commissioners like sharing from their own experience. So as a broader invitation.
I statements also are typically used to express feelings, perspectives, I'd imagine. Would you move to keep that into perhaps speak from your own experience, expertise, and perspective?
Sounds good to me. Yeah.
Is there any, and I will stop the share so I can see folks. Is there any opposition to that proposed amendment or revision? Okay. Seeing none, I think I have the proposed language. It was speak from your experience, expertise, and perspective. And maybe it's the full one is use I statements, period. Speak from you, etc. Okay, so we'll reflect that as a revision. Commissioner Van Ness.
Thank you. I don't know if this is the right time to bring this up, but I would propose that we add something along the lines, given that we've been told time and time again, we're on such a short timeline and that the meetings, we only have certain periods of time. let's focus the agendas on what our task is at hand. And our task at hand is a fairly simple task. And so I respect, discussions about all of these other issues, but I really think we should narrow the field so that we all can get back to our lives and our jobs and our families and not waste time that's unnecessary.
Commissioner, do you have thoughts on some of the agenda items that you might think are
Well,
more
for
focused on
example,
task
I
and
don't-
less focused?
For example, we all received in advance the entire schedule and each month schedule. I don't know that we need to reiterate that during the meeting where we have the public who are taking time out of their lives to participate. I just don't think it's necessary for us to focus on some of the minutia when we are apprised of that entire content and the media, or excuse me, the public can access. I would just like to get down to the work at hand.
Do you have a proposal for an
I
agreement?
don't know. This isn't in my realm of, I don't know if I'm supposed to ask for something. I'm just trying to create a dialogue about this issue, that we just start focusing as a commission on what our jobs are. I'll defer to the city staff for advice on how we proceed on that.
Commissioner Lumley, I think I saw your hand first, and then Commissioner Weiss.
Thank you. I know it's difficult to go through processes at the beginning when you have to adopt your founding documents. It's important for us to go through this process because it lays foundation how we're going to relate to each other and reach a final conclusion by September 1st. So in my opinion, we just have to power through this and get through as fast as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Weiss.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just gonna say, in my experience, especially from being on the advocate side, government is just like really hard sometimes to get a hold of, and we have weird systems that are not first nature to a lot of folks, and so from my experience, like being able to have things kind of be spelled out and make sure that folks are able to follow along. I do think that's important. I do also see on our document that we have like keeping multitasking at a minimum. And really, I'd like to your or to the point earlier made. I want to make sure that we do have that we are able to focus on our task at hand. So I don't know if we want to just like expand the point around not multitasking and making sure that commissioners are focused with the time that we do have, and also respecting the time frame that we have set out for our meetings. Like to me that makes sense because we're also planning things before and after these meetings, and so I do want to we could add that, but I do want to just highlight that government is usually very inaccessible, and so I want to make sure that we are creating a safe space as possible for folks to be able to participate.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll go to Commissioner Chisholm first, and then I do have some draft language to consider for 0.5 around keeping multitasking to a minimum. Commissioner Chisholm.
Yeah, I think maybe one edit we could make to this working agreement that would be responsive to Commissioner Van Ness's suggestion might be on number 6. Just strike the word meeting. In other words, keep the focus on our designated objectives, utilizing the facilitator and so on. Like, it's not about are we on the agenda of this meeting, but are we on the objective of the whole project? Every meeting, every task is on the big picture, staying away from extraneous notions. That's my one thought, is maybe as much as possible, just that one word edit would, I think, get us there. Edie, does that work for you?
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
So we have two proposed revisions. We'll start with the most recent, eliminating meeting, the word meeting from item 6, and for E5, in line with Commissioner Wise's feedback, we could adapt this one to keep multitasking to a minimum, ensure commissioners ensure we remain focused and honor allocated time for meetings and perhaps the process. Or so let's say, ensure commissioners remain focused and honor allocated time for meetings. Okay, if there is no, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop my share. There's no opposition to those two changes. We'll note them as revisions for the document. And if those are the final revisions, we can also move to adopt pending these revisions. So, any other items to cover? Seeing none. If we're ready to adopt, I'll look for any opposition. All right, seeing none. We'll make those revisions and then we'll have that final document ready. And thank you to all provided feedback there and help us get to a final document. Adam, do you? Perfect, thank you. So we're going to move on to so the community engagement work group did meet on Monday, and we'll provide an update for the progress there. Adam?
Hey, everyone. Like Adam said, we had the community engagement work group meet on Monday, and I'm just going to advance to the next slide here. Oh, I need to get back into true presenter mode and just go over some of the kind of key takeaways that we had, and then Autumn will walk us through some red line documents that we've seen before. As far as feedback on the framework and values, the 4 commissioners agreed that ensuring community has the adequate information to meaningfully engage in this work. In 3 areas that they identified were general accessibility. So in the case where there's a meeting in person, that folks are able to actually get to the meeting and it's accessible to folks with any disabilities. Content accessibility would be kind of boiling down any of the complex map jargon that we heard about in the last meeting from Paul Mitchell. So it's digestible by folks in the communities, and logistical accessibility is the calls we've heard to make sure we're adequately doing translation services and the like for any of our both in-person and virtual meetings with community members. Also ensuring that there are clear and accessible pathways throughout for community to join and provide input, be that in these public hearings that we're having or in the case of creating public comments, making sure that folks have a chance to testify, to do that in the meetings, and if they can't make it to the meetings, are well aware of the various ways that they can do so in writing. Promote transparency in communications and input received, and that has a lot to do with commissioners being concerned that we're not just taking this public comment in and just sitting on it, making sure that we are constantly looking at it, reviewing it, and responding to it appropriately in meetings to come. And holding the Independent District Commission accountable, really establishing the best way to do that is more of a concern that was raised, and for broader discussion amongst y'all. As far as feedback on the public hearings from the work group, just the big concern is for asking community about their priorities. How does community define their community? Asking community what their priorities are. How do they define community, or how how they define community differ from block to block? How does community experience their own experience in their own part of the city, and how does community think of the division of the city? How do you elevate community priorities? Desired outcomes of the hearing, opportunity for folks to hear how opportunity to hear from community how they define boundaries, opportunity to educate and share what this process is, what we are doing, and why, and live our values and incorporate our values into these hearings that we've been working on in the past meeting. We want to begin outreach now so people are engaged, or sorry, when I say the term we, I mean the Independent District Commissioner Work Group, just for clarity purposes, are engaged early in the process and are not hearing about what happens once the work is all done. Ensuring that we are constantly reporting out on the input received and having a clear cadence of outreach and reporting structure. And that goes back to the last set of accountability and dealing with the public comments, and ensure that we are telling and sharing community how we made the decision. And I just want to pause and ask if any of the commissioners that were at the community engagement work group meeting want to chime in and expand upon any of these before we send it out to the bigger group.
And I should also just note for the record, the subcommittee members or working group members were included Commissioner Judd, Commissioner Kimura, Commissioner Lorente, and Commissioner Hanson. Commissioner Hanson.
First of all, thank you, Adam, for that great recap of the meeting. The one thing I will add is the sort of why behind that list of half a dozen questions at the top of the slide that we're all seeing, the asking community about their priorities. The group had a conversation about really wanting to say to people, hey, like this is the information that would be most helpful for us. So if you have opinions about, these 6 questions, or, this is the working version of those questions, like this is what we want to hear from you. And if you have thoughts or opinions about these things, please bring them to us, and we, invite you to bring those. So that was sort of the why behind those questions at the top. And then the one other thing I will say to the previous slide was we had a conversation also about really wanting to be as intentional as possible about meeting communities where they are, like meeting people where they are, and not just like yes, having clear and accessible pathways, and also not just expecting that to be one directional and expecting people to come to us, but really kind of thinking about where we can find folks who might not be the first in line to come and share their thoughts. And if other commissioners who are on the meeting have other stuff to add, please do.
And just real quick, did any of the other commissioners that were there, just one last check, want to chime in before we move out to everyone else? Okay, and just before we jump into the rest of the commissioners to discuss this, I just do want to encourage, if you're interested, shoot me an email, and if you'd like to join the next one of these work groups, the more the merrier. The engagement is what really is going to get the community getting those comments in and help us do our jobs the right way.
And I got it. Perfect. Commissioner Chisholm.
Yeah, and first of all, thank you to those who showed up at yet another meeting and put this together. Thank you very much. Maybe I missed it in the earlier meeting or in an email somewhere, but can you tell us about the process by which people are being asked to serve on these various work groups and are volunteering for the work groups? Like, how is this selection process happening?
We are taking volunteers. So the volunteers for this work session, I think due to time limitations, we had that process in an email, and folks reach out to Sophia to indicate that they wanted to join, and we can incorporate others who want to join going forward as well.
Thank you.
Of course. Commissioner Manjarres.
Thank you. And also want to express so much appreciation for folks who sat down to dig into this. I feel like this is really the heart of what we're doing here. And so I just wanted to, I guess, give some feedback, or if we're at the stage of feedback on where we're at right now, because I think this is a great starting point, is in the next slide, how does community identify or define their community? I think maybe there's also a step before this. So if some folks don't identify this way in terms of this language, so they don't come as a member of a community first, right? So I think there's even maybe a step question before this by asking folks in very plain language, you know, which communities do you identify with, in a very general way, like not in a multiple choice way. And people might share interesting perspectives. It might be, I identify with my local church. I might identify with my, you know, this neighborhood. So I just think there's so many different ways people could answer that. And maybe that's the step before this. I feel like if we start with this first bullet, it may make folks who don't identify this way feel like they can't come forward and share their experience. But I think overall this is great. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will move to Commissioner Van Ness, but I did want to note as well that this framework should be informing the work plan that will come next. And so some of the specific questions we can also workshop, including potentially adding that one and others, if you would like to know more and expand. So we'll move to Commissioner Van Ness, followed by Commissioner Judd.
Thank you. I just wanted to confirm that I'm guessing all of us have community outreach, communities, groups, associations that we're going to want to bring in. This is not limiting that, because some of us aren't able to, don't have the time to be able to do additional meetings, but I want to make sure that all of our voices and our communities are heard when that time comes, and that we will get notice and get that information in advance.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just as a point of process, all meetings, so all formal public meetings will have advance notice. And then I think you also spoke to kind of individual connections to our community.
Well, my question is,
yes,
like, that we will still have an opportunity, if we're not on the subcommittee, to have community outreach events about this process during this process.
Yes, the subcommittee. So this work was really around the definitional work, the planning, essentially establishing the framework and working towards the plan itself. The commission as a whole, including staff and those who support, will work around coordinated community outreach. You also may want to incorporate within your work plan other mechanisms that don't rely on the entire body, but still allow for proactive outreach as well. Less formal, but maybe more effective for reaching certain members of the community. Commissioner Judd.
Just want to follow up with Commissioner Machada's comment around having individuals recognize different definitions of how they relate to their community. One of the things that we did talk about was having individuals and or groups define what are kind of their recognized centers within their communities, meaning that, like, and you can leave it broadly open. So whether it's a social, economic, religious, what are the things that are you most value about the community that you're in? Where's that? Where do you go to? Where do you migrate to on a regular basis? So just to having that open question, I think that was one piece as she made that comment that reminded me that we didn't capture that as a note, but that's a great addition.
Thank you, Commissioner. So having walked through the high level version, so the community engagement framework, so incorporating all of the elements you see here, and then the broader discussion, we went back to the original draft and produced a red line version that expands on certain areas. This will not be as tedious as it looks. This is mostly to be able to show the red line version. There's also a document, and I haven't seen that drop into the chat. So do you mind dropping the red lined full version as well?
Yeah. Yep, doing that right now.
So we will go through section by section just to show the level of changes. The values document actually did not have as many extensive changes, but had more focused expansion of language. If these documents look good as is, once we finish this section, we can move to adopt. If the commission feels that you'd still like to workshop them or spend more time, we can move to adopt in the next meeting, but I will leave that, of course, up to you. So the first set of changes really focused on tying specifically noting the use of the work plan to focus on the mechanisms around how the principles established in the frameworks would be implemented. So just making a more explicit connection between those documents, and just establishing the broader purpose of this document in itself, really to have it serve as the statement of the foundational vision, principles, and objectives of the commission that will later guide, of course, the development of the plan, but also your actions and approach and decisions that you'll make throughout the entire process. I'll move to the next slide. And most of the first portion of the vision remained unchanged, as it was fairly consistent with what we heard from the commissioners within the work group. But we moved to put more, establish more of the connection around the principles of fostering trust and accountability. Those also came up in the last full session of the commission as well. And so we made sure to establish that in the vision statement. The larger expansion at the end here talks about, I think Commissioner Hansen, you spoke to this, the proactive nature of the outreach and really working to use as a principle, not being passive, looking for ways to get out of one mode transportation or some of the standards, expecting folks to come to us, really looking at different ways to be dynamic in approaching community engagement and what that means. Being proactive also means, to some of the points earlier, really opening up and allowing discussion around identity, association with community, and using that as a starting ground for undertaking this process. Adam? For the specific set of expectations, some elements of this appeared in other documents, including working agreements, and it really is, this section is really intended to set the expectations around what should form a work plan. So for instance, intentionally encouraging discourse, again, breaking out of one-way communication cycles, encouraging discourse among community members to assist the commissioners. This point is supposed to recognize that there will be discussions probably with and among the commission, but there will also be inter and intra-community discussions as well that won't necessarily involve you explicitly, but there are ways and mechanisms to use that information to inform your decisions. Specifically, leveraging process tools and opportunities to foster that proactive and accessible learning, sharing, and understanding. So this is more of the how, the mechanisms, establishing that as both an accountability mechanism and just a tool to aid your work. Expanding around, just similar to what we even did in this commission, being able to deepen the understanding around the requirements of Measure 26-28, but also state, federal, and local regulations that the commission must adhere to. And just being very clear about that. That includes stripping out jargon whenever possible and making that information accessible. And then finally, just tying a little bit more specificity. What is the city going to look like in several years as a result of this project, and really just tying those outcomes together. And then Adam, I think we have one more here. this is really about some of the discussion that came up in the larger commission in the last session, as well as in the working group, really making the connection between stated principles and how we live them. And so just seeking to establish more accountability, seeking to actively establish those accountability mechanisms, and then enumerating some of those approaches that you may consider as part of the work plan, including what we've already stated, reducing the jargon, documenting, making note of public comments in these meetings, responding to them, acknowledging them, maximizing accessibility, and seeking non-traditional outlets. Okay. And Adam largely didn't change, but we did expand this language to not be to be more specific about potential mediums, including, as others have stated today, meetings, hearings, comments, written and otherwise, as well as outreach potentially by individual commissioners. So that see if there are any thoughts, reactions to some of those changes. Can we get a sense of where others are in terms of the state of this document? Okay. I'd like to move to the values as well, and then because they are related, pretty minor changes here. Again, just creating that explicit tie between the work plan, the working agreements, and just ensuring that those are in line with the values document. And Adam. And then the value statements for most of the sections have not changed. So this is the version that you've seen before. So we'll move. So we have anti-racism and then the specifics there. Equity and the specific value statements there that have been articulated. Accountability, here's where we did expand based on the feedback. So specifically the Office of Equity and Human Rights, just really expanding this section a bit more to actually call for leveraging the guidance and the best practices there from that office, and establishing that accountability is the basis of trust and making that more explicit to incorporate that as the value as stated by multiple commissioners. Transparency remains unchanged, as do communication and collaboration. And fiscal responsibility, we spoke to that earlier. There was some discussion around what role the fiscal responsibility, how do we talk about our responsibility there? That's remained unchanged as well. So we'll start with the document and okay, we're back at, yeah, perfect. So we'll start with the values document, as it did not change substantively, because it's already pretty representative of what we heard from the commission. Is there any opposition to adopting the values pending the changes? And Adam, do you mind going back just to the accountability and trust section? Commissioner Manjarrez?
Yeah, I don't have opposition to the values, but can I just maybe ask a little bit for clarification? I think we could even move forward because I don't have a lot of changes, is to clarify sort of our internal operating values and the values that we're going to use to inform our decision making, particularly around criteria, because I think this is going to be really important. When we get to the criteria draft, I think it's going to be important that there's a through line from these values and how those show up in that criteria. And so having that in not just, definitions of the criteria, but how they're informed by these values is going to be really important. So I do think there's sort of a distinction that needs to be drawn with some of these. For example, I think that going back to the list now, just to put a finer point on it, I think that there's a value here around, folks feeling a sense of belonging, support, safety, et cetera. Obviously, I think that would be one that would inform some of the criteria, but I think there are some that are just more internal around how we work together. And maybe organizing it so those are a little bit more clear would be really helpful. And again, just to say that I would hope and expect to see this in sort of the draft that we create around criteria so that we can see this in practice.
A framework like that could be one of those accountability mechanisms that you just described. Commissioner Monaghan is literally creating those through lines specifically to identify how it would guide your work. That's a great example. And we've made a note of that as well. Perfect. Thanks, Sophia. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Lumley.
Thank you. At the last meeting, I had made a comment about adding to the anti-Blackness language that we should be recognizing other historically discriminated groups as well. And there seemed to be quite a bit of agreement from the group. And I was looking at the minutes, and it is also reflected in the minutes. So I would like to see some of that language added. Thank you.
And Adam, do you mind going to the anti-racism slide? I think it's about 4 back. And also there is specific language around the community engagement framework. There was a discussion around, one tenet of approaching anti-Blackness in terms of anti-racism is that as a significantly marginalized group, addressing anti-Blackness does inherently help to address oppression that is experienced by other groups. So leading with anti-Blackness is in itself a way to establish frameworks, norms, cultural reforms, and changes in thinking that actually benefit the community more broadly. So I do recall that being part of the discussion as well. Would you like to make a proposal to explain? I guess you did make a proposal to explain.
I did, yeah.
So.
And I really do appreciate the language in here about leading with anti-Blackness, but it is very different forms of discrimination when you work with LGBT communities or people with disabilities. And I thought we had a good discussion at the last meeting about including some language to that effect. And you don't have to necessarily call out those groups, but referencing them generally as other historically discriminated groups.
Would you propose in a revision, for instance, that says addressing issues concerning anti-Blackness will be a priority for the workforce and city in its attempt to address this is anti-racism.
It could be
oppression experienced by other groups. Yeah.
It could be at the end of that sentence in that bullet. This is and other historically discriminated groups.
Commissioner Saxena, I see your hand raised, and then Commissioner Hanson.
Yeah, I think there may also be another slide on equity. I wonder if we want to look at the anti-racism and the equity slides together to see if it should be on, because I agree with Commissioner Lumley, it does need to be somewhere in here. But to try to figure out where it should be either, just because they're separated on different slides, so it's hard to see them together.
So I will go to Commissioner Hanson and we can look at the best place to add this as well. Commissioner Hanson.
Yeah, I really appreciate the last 2 comments, and I was going to make a suggestion this could be either in the anti-racism section or in the equity section. Like in the anti-racism section, for example, specifically calling out the importance of an intersectional lens. There was a conversation, right, that it's not just different groups, but the idea of intersectionality being that, you know, different marginalized identities in the same body compound, right? These systems compound on each other. Race, of course, being the front one in this society, and also ability and sexual orientation and gender identity and like all of these other things kind of compounding. So perhaps like introducing a line maybe to the anti-racist lens that, like, you know, when we are like addressing anti-racism in like an explicitly intersectional lens, like with an explicitly intersectional lens, taking into account other identities as well, something like that. I think the one place that I see intersectionality coming up in here is under equity, which is more about like intersectional identities being valued. And what I think I'm hearing is like more than intersectional identities being valued, but like actively sort of considered and organized around. So that was going to be my offer for English.
Thank you, Commissioner. So we do have limited time and we do have a full presentation. So what we can do is revise this document to tie together the aspects around other marginalized identities and including taking an intersectional lens. Provide that revision and then bring it back to this group. For the community engagement framework, I do want to get a sense is there any opposition to adopting the document with the changes, or because they were so extensive, would you like to have time to review that, additional time to review that and consider it in the next meeting? So I would look for a motion here on one direction or the other.
I'll move to adopt the value statement document with those 2 additions.
Okay. Pending the 2 additions. Okay. And do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, perfect. So pending the addition of language, including identifying additional marginalized communities and intersectionality, we move to adopt. Any opposition to moving to adopting the value statement? Okay. Seeing none, we will make those changes and they'll be reflected in the version you'll see.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for the community engagement framework, is there a motion to adopt it pending the more extensive changes? Okay, seeing none, we'll reserve that for committee business in the next meeting. Okay, but please have if you do have revisions, please have them prepared, or you can provide them to staff after this meeting as well. Okay, and with that, we are ready to move to Flo's presentation. You all set there? Okay, Kimmy. And team.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for having us. And I do not believe our presentation is quite as jam-packed or as long as Paul Mitchell's presentation was the last time, but we do have some important pieces to go over. And I believe that Alex will be running our slides. So when he has those up, here we go. Okay. Yep, perfect. Okay, so we're going to be reviewing sort of the districting process and some data aspects, and also answering any questions you have about the criteria that I know you discussed a little bit earlier tonight. So next slide. So just really briefly, this is our team some of our team at Flow Analytics. And a quick introduction to folks that you'll see most often will be Tyler Vick, myself, Alex, and then Charles Reinerson, who is one of our senior demographers. Our other staff who are listed below are sort of our behind the scenes folks. So we'll be doing a lot of the mapping and a lot of the analysis that we'll be doing for the commission as we move forward. Next slide. And just really quickly, this is sort of our brief overview of the process. We're focused right now internally on the data collection, and we'll be discussing the criteria development once it's approved by the commission. Then it's community input, and then we're on to draft maps, which is the next exciting part for us. And then community input again, and then hopefully a quick and smooth process to final map adoption. The draft map and the final map adoption are both intended to be iterative processes, which means that we'll present you with some pieces and then we'll kind of work through them based on your input and the community input you receive. So next slide. I'm sure you all are very familiar with this piece about what's changing within the city. So I won't go over that too long. Next slide. And so this is the districting criteria piece. And I think that the critical piece here, as Paul sort of went over at the first meeting, that these criteria very closely match what's been upheld by the courts nationally with the addition of the compactness piece. When you consider as a commission whether to add additional criteria, I think that it's important to just sort of bear in mind that when you add additional criteria, you are in a way putting some constraints on the maps that we would be able to take a look at. So more criteria also means that there may be maps that would then be excluded from the process because they wouldn't meet those additional criteria. So from our perspective, to ensure the broadest range of input, you would want to keep the criteria sort of as at a minimal as ideal. Commissioner Van Ness, do you have a question?
Thank you. I just don't think we should start this way with advising. We haven't even had a chance to talk as a commission. And so I don't think it's appropriate for you to advise us on what would make things more challenging. We haven't had an opportunity to ask you about your background, who you are, how you were vetted. So please, if we could defer to or restrain ourselves from suggesting things that the commission should be deciding on, I would appreciate that.
Okay. All right. I can appreciate your point of view. So we'll back it up. Alex, can you go to the next slide?
Kim, do you mind? I did want to jump in just to say, so from a data perspective, helping to understand the criteria and the limitations of data and how they intersect is actually a technical process. So for instance, complicating the maps, I think the idea is like from a technical perspective, there may be difficulty in adhering to certain criteria when they are layered out. That is just true from an approach to establishing maps. And that's the complexity, as I understand.
Sure, of course, but the language in the charter is not as defined as what is being shared today. And there's language that says to the best of our abilities, meaning like contiguous. That's something that the commission needs to address and work through. And we're on meeting 2, and yet we have not even had an opportunity to start working on this stuff. So I would ask you respectfully to refrain from defining what our parameters are. And I'll end there.
Commissioner Hanson, did you have a question?
Oh, I was just going to respond briefly to Commissioner Van Ness and say I totally hear that, and I appreciated the conversation earlier, and do think it's important that we as a commission can, not necessarily be influenced and be having our internal conversations and making the decisions ourselves. Speaking entirely for myself, I find it incredibly valuable to hear from experts who have done this in dozens, if not hundreds, of jurisdictions across the country, both the session last time and then this one tonight. So I think I'm in a place where I want as much data and other people's experiences and learnings and best practices as possible. So then we as a commission can take that information and figure out what is best for our unique situation. So just to offer a slightly different perspective, and gratitude to Flow Analytics for this information and the detail of it.
Okay. So moving forward, I think that, and I'm sorry if this was misconstrued, the criteria that was in the charter language does closely follow what's been upheld by courts on a national basis. So there are other data sets besides the basics that we will be going over tonight. And so this slide just gives you sort of some examples, and this is not by any stretch the end of the data, or this is all that's available. But there are other data sets that you might consider for input on maps, or when you're looking at information that you might find valuable in this process. So things like voter precincts, school districts, school locations, transportation, parks. Often in cities, parks can be a pretty pivotal point. Fire stations, hospitals, all of those kinds of things. Population is the demographics that we'll be going over a small piece of tonight. Socioeconomics is also another factor that does often come up in this districting process. Internet access was actually something that had been submitted to us. And so it is something that we're researching, and we should have some data on for you as well. Legislative boundaries, sometimes cities have questions about, where the legislative lines lay across the city and those kinds of things. And so that's also data that's easily available. The American Community Survey has an immense amount of data in it, and it covers a wide variety of issues. And so there are also other data sets outside of the American Community Service, the Portland Metro Regional Land Information System, Multnomah County, the other counties surrounding you. All of these have data that's available on all of these factors. So as you go through this process and you receive public comment or you receive community input, just know that some of that is mappable. Oftentimes, most of it is mappable. Sometimes the information is not mappable, but might be related to a data set we can't access. So it's always worth having those conversations. Commissioner Chisholm?
Thank you. This is a great summary. And maybe it's on another slide, so please stop me if I'm jumping ahead. First of all, I'm not seeing anything here about ethnicity, race and ethnicity, or language groups.
So the race and ethnicity is coming up right after right after me.
In addition to neighborhood organizations, I would ask us to look at business associations. They often overlap with neighborhood groups or can be larger or smaller than them, but those also often reflect the way people think in terms of community, the Jade District, for example. And then another thought I have here is that maybe useful local context here is because Oregon is the first state that vote by mail, Multnomah County in particular has had a long history of expanding voting precincts as large as possible. A voting precinct, of course, is a total fiction, has nothing to do with anything other than everyone within a precinct gets the same ballot. In other states where you have precincts that are very small, they're designed because it's walkable, right? You walk to your precinct to vote at the church or the elementary school or whatever. Whereas in Multnomah County with 25 years of vote by mail, we've blown the precincts out very large. And of course, when we redistrict, they will redraw the precincts because if we split an existing precinct in half, it'll become 2 precincts to get different ballots. So that's the one thing I would just toss out entirely. It's a fictional construct of election administration rather than anything that relates to community and culture and neighborhood and population.
Sure, and I will say that Alex will be going over a great deal of some of that in addition to census blocks and how those factor into this process. And I thought I saw another hand up and then it went away off my screen. So, oh, I see it now. Commissioner Saxena?
Oh, I just had a thought and I was thinking about putting it in the chat, but I also was thinking in addition to parks, library branches, just because they're such great meeting spaces and we don't necessarily want to we want to make sure that we're not drawing a district that doesn't have enough gathering and meeting spaces in it.
All right, and so at this point, I turn it over to Alex to go over some of the more detailed aspects of this.
Kimmy. As Kimmy mentioned earlier, my name is Alex Brosh. I'm a senior population geographer with Flow. And so before we dive into this of the numbers for Portland at large total population and also by race ethnicity, I just wanted to say it's important to review how race and ethnicity information is collected and categorized by the Census Bureau. So the 2020 census used two separate questions, one for race and one for Hispanic or Latino origin. And those are required to follow standards that are set by the U.S. Office of Management Budget, or OMB, based on rulings from 1997. So the racial categories include this in the census questionnaire generally reflect a social definition of race recognized in this country and not an attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically. And OMB requires 5 minimum categories, which are white, Black or African American, American Indian and Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander. And also included are some other race and 2 or more, which includes the many combinations. Okay, so then Hispanic origin can be viewed as the heritage, nationality, lineage, or country of birth of a person or the person's parents and ancestors. So people who identify as Hispanic or Latino may be any race. Improvements and changes between 2010 and the 2020 decennial censuses enabled a more thorough and accurate depiction of how people self-identify, and that yielded a more accurate portrait of how people report their Hispanic origin and race, even within the context of just a 2-question format. So these changes really revealed like the US population is much more multiracial and diverse than we had measured in the past with the 2010 census and prior. So this is a table of the demographics of the city. They're broken out a few different ways within the census. So the decennial census, and in 2020, I'm talking about the data that's available. That's PL 94171 redistricting data. That includes total population and the voting age population, which is everyone over the age of 18 and older. And they do that by race ethnicity. And then I want to mention as we go through this table that is different from the citizen voting age population by race ethnicity that is used to assess compliance with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And that's based upon the American Community Survey, or ACS. So I'll linger on this slide just a little bit. We can look through each row of the data. So the first one, that's by race. That's why you don't see an entry for Hispanic and Latino. That's from the decennial census. Second line down, race ethnicity. That is then adding in the second question of Hispanic or Latino origin. That's also decennial census. VAP or VAP, as it's often called, that's the voting age population. Then that's broken down, as you can see, by race, and then race and ethnicity. And then lastly, we have CVAP, citizen voting age population by race ethnicity. And that's those estimates that are coming from the American Community Survey, which I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between decennial census and ACS in just a bit. So just another way to view this, obviously, is by percentage of total population or by voting age population. So I just want to show this in a different way to kind of help people understand. It's not just the total sheer population, but by percentage. So some of the data, the central data we'll be working with, aside from what Kimmy showed with the other potential pieces of data we can look at, Census Bureau geographies. Those include legal and administrative boundaries like states and counties, but also statistical areas like tracts, block groups, and blocks. And the differences between decennial census and ACS are that decennial census asks that pretty small set of questions about people in homes and in group living situations, including how many people or stay in each home and their age, sex, race, ethnicity. And that's a really important difference between decennial census and the ACS, is that the census is an enumeration, meaning it aims to count the entire population, not just an estimate or a subset of the population. So I've mentioned it now before, but the ACS includes estimates of socioeconomic variables, things like median household income or educational attainment. And the primary purpose of the ACS, which was essentially the long form, if people remember that from prior censuses, that's measuring the changing and social economic characteristics of the US population. So that's including topics like education, housing, jobs, and more.
I think I see a question from Commissioner Van Ness, Alex.
Yes.
Okay with that?
Just a quick question. Does the ACS data anticipate likely voters in the future? Is that part of the equation?
It does not make population projections, no.
So does it just anticipate what the I guess physical population will be in that area at some point in the future?
Not in the future, it's rather looking at a point in time, which would be either the ACS can be broken down by a year or a 5-year, roughly like a 5-year average. So it's looking at population. Right now, the most current ACS data that's available is covering 2017 to 2021. And that's going to have information that is a whole host of socioeconomic variables that we could talk a little bit more about. Yeah.
So can you educate me on like what the benefit is of this data versus the other data?
The ACS isn't absolutely necessary to the districting process, except for having the citizen voting age population data broken down by race, ethnicity, so that we can ensure that we're in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. Other than that, the ACS is not necessary for this. It might come into play when you guys discuss a potential additional criteria.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful.
One more question?
Commissioner Manhattan.
Yeah, and just to add, Alex, it would be helpful to just clarify too the frequency of these, because part of it is we have our decennial census data, and we just had obviously a census happen, and we had it happen during a weird time. And ACS data, even though it's maybe less or just happens differently, I should say that, it's coming in more frequently. So they could each serve different purposes to give context in different ways. So maybe even talking a little bit about, even though we're talking about census data, this isn't absolutely necessary. It's another data point, right? And what the value of that could be for this process.
Yep, that is true. Thank you. So just last bullet points on there. We've already hit on that last slide. That's supplemental data that could be included in the process. Things like school district boundaries, other important communities of interest, and things that are available to us. Talking a bit about census geographies and those statistical areas. I just want to make sure we're all clear on what those are. So we're going to be working with the census block mostly. That's the smallest geographic unit used by the Census Bureau. It's the smallest, and that means the blocks cannot be split because the Census Bureau doesn't certify the enumerations for smaller geographic areas. There's statistical areas that are bounded by visible features such as streets, roads, streams, railroad tracks, but also non-visible boundaries like selected property lines. And generally, census blocks are small in area, so a lot of the ones we'll be seeing in the city of Portland, they really will be a city block. But census blocks in suburban rural areas might be large and irregular, bounded by other features like roads or transmission lines. We might see a little bit of that in Northwest, by Forest Park. In remote areas, census blocks can be hundreds of square miles. Probably won't encounter such large blocks in our work here. So census blocks nest within other statistical geographies, like this graphic shows, they go up into block groups, and then block groups go up into census tracts and so on. So just wanted to reiterate a point made earlier that the IDC cannot split blocks and accurately report population statistics confidently. Therefore, strive to use the blocks as the literal building blocks to create districts.
Actually,
quick
Alex.
question
Oh,
there.
sorry. Yep.
Commissioner Turner.
I was poking around, looking at census blocks and, digging into maps. And I agree, we should almost certainly not break up census blocks. These are the Legos we're building with. I did notice a few instances when I was looking at, there are places where a neighborhood organization boundary, a neighborhood association boundary, it splits through the middle of a census block. Is it completely legally impermissible for us to break a census block? Or is it that we really, really, really shouldn't, but if it meets one of our other criteria, like going down an existing boundary or keeping a school district together or a neighborhood association, we can do that knowing that we can't quite enumerate just how many are in the district, but that's okay because if the census block has like 9 people in it, well, we're trying to get to within a 5% margin of error. So therefore, if it's 6 and 3 or 8 and 1 or 2 and whatever, it doesn't matter because it's within the margin of error that's acceptable to us. Those, legally impermissible to split census blocks or just a really bad idea?
I'm going to leave the legal question to the legal experts for next time, but I will say in our experience and other districting or redistricting projects I've worked on, census blocks were not split.
And we have noted that as a follow-up question for the city attorney's office. And Commissioner Majares?
Yeah, I like the creativity. I think it's great. And the creative thinking. I do think that as we get through this and we're coming up with these questions, there's an element of maintaining the integrity of the data. So if we do start doing that, I think it's going to start, one, it could be a slippery slope in terms of you do it for one neighborhood association, you do it for others. And if this is the level of data that it's going to allow us to say, this is what population looks like in this area, I think we have to balance those pieces. So I will say personally, I would feel uncomfortable breaking up blocks where we would lose or start to question the integrity of the data or what we're saying actually exists in certain communities to accommodate. So I do think that as we get into sort of a more decision-making place in terms of what the foundation setting is, just wanted to express that I would have discomfort with that and that we need to sort of balance those pieces. So just wanted to respond to that quickly as we're moving along.
I'm certainly not suggesting that we should. It is at minimum a very bad idea. I was wondering if it's tougher than that, but we'll take it for later. Thank you.
And Commissioner Vencejones?
Yeah, I just wanted to say too, I know that a lot of us have lived here in Portland for a long time. And on the question of neighborhoods, for instance, I grew up in a neighborhood that was called something that's not even called that anymore. So I think that taking something like a neighborhood boundary and overlaying it where we might mess with our ability to count and use recognized statistics on the numbers is something I would be concerned about.
Thank you, Commissioner. Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, this slide is just to do a quick recap of the equal population criterion. So on the left, we'll see that the total population of Portland, based on the 2020 decennial census, was just over 650,000. And therefore, the ideal population per district, which is simply the city's total population divided by the number of districts 4, is 163,126. So that's going to help us assess if the district plan meets the equal population criterion by looking at that number. So we need to calculate each district's deviation from that ideal. So on the right side to demonstrate that, we have some example data where the district plan has the total population per district and then the associated deviation in relation to the ideal. So those are the numbers like negative 1.3% for District 1, it's hypothetical District 1. And then you'll see at the bottom, it's called different things, but overall range or overall deviation is calculated as the absolute sum of the deviation of the least populated district and the most populated district. So if we add 3.6 and 2.9, we get 6.5%. And that's the number we've been discussing about keeping as near zero as possible. And League and Council discussed earlier about keeping that less than 5% would be something to strive for. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, just reiterating that the IDC is tasked with the creation of the 4 districts. And we're going to have those constitute the city of Portland. So that looks like you're all well aware. We're going to strive to do this while meeting the criteria that have been set forth for us. You guys will all be talking about that in future meetings. But we will be able to support the process and your questions by viewing the data. So here we're looking at a map of total population by block. So you can see things like total population density and know when you make a change on a map or incorporate a nearby neighborhood, how dense is the population there. Same thing goes for some of those other supplemental data sets that will be available to us. For instance, looking at neighborhood association boundaries, precincts, school districts, whatever the IDC deems to be important. This is going to go along with the criteria such as drawing districts that use geographic and political boundaries. And then thinking about the other criteria that are put forth to not draw districts for the purpose of diluting voting strength or any language or ethnic group. So having that data that I showed in the tabular format, being able to visualize that on maps. And with that, I'll pass it back to Kimmy. Or potentially take a question from Commissioner Benzick.
Commissioner Sickle Robbins, is that hand from the last round? I thought so. I think it is. So Kimmy,
Okay,
thanks, Commissioner.
sure. So our next steps as the consultant are really to then start to dive into the mechanics of creating districts and measuring the criteria that the commission decides on. And so, and I had mentioned earlier that it is an iterative process. And so I think later in April, when we have kind of gone through the public hearing piece with the commission's criteria, we will come back to the commission. We'll be here throughout the other discussions as well. But their next kind of presentation point will be providing what we call springboard maps, which are really not meant to be directive, but meant to be the start of an iterative process where then the commission can discuss priorities and give us feedback about what those priorities look like in terms of mapping and in terms of the data and how we move forward through that process for the draft mapping piece. And that is a couple of steps ahead, I think, of where we are tonight. But I just wanted to sort of let the commission kind of contemplate that a little bit. And so that if there are data sets or data points that you're interested in seeing, that you can communicate that to Sophia, and then we can make sure that we're building those into our mapping system so that we have those sort of in our back pocket when we get there. Commissioner Van Ness, did you have a question?
There was a citizen who had a question that I wanted to make sure we got to. Steve Pinger asked, don't the recently compiled neighborhood profiles provide as much, if not more, demographic data as the census blocks, but are more reflective of existing geographic or political boundaries and communities of common interests?
Alex, did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I can. I'm not aware in depth of those profiles, but I will say that we do need to use the decennial census total population for our work in constructing the districts. Whether the profile information may be akin to American Community Survey in terms of socioeconomics, that's something that the IDC could weigh in on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Manhattan?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I'm also not familiar with the neighborhood profile. So maybe if it's something that we're going to use, it could be, we could have more information about what it is, who compiled it, how often it's compiled, et cetera.
And I think barring any questions, Commissioner Chisholm.
Thank you. This is very good. I want to make sure I understand the precise sort of process that we're going to go through when we actually get to the map drawing piece. Obviously, we're going to first have some conversations about criteria, we have public comment about that. But then the next step is that you all will be providing for us the, what do you call them, springboard maps, which will be sort of starter conversation maps. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then to add another layer on this, the district, we are working on an instance of District R or Districtor, depending on who's saying it, and which is a sort of a public facing mapping option for the community to be able to use. And we can certainly demo that for the commission, perhaps at the next meeting or when there's some time in some space, I think, in your very packed schedule. And so the point of District R, Districtor is really to be a pretty simplified way for people, members of the community or anybody else really, to be able to draw and submit maps to the commission. And then part of what we do is to take those maps and use the criteria that the commission decides upon to do some evaluation in terms of whether they meet the criteria or they don't meet the criteria and the population, and sort of those pieces, and give you that feedback as well as part of the public comment. So and I'm just layering that onto everything else that's going to be happening, because I think it's an important piece for folks to understand that there is that option that will be coming. But the iterative process is really sort of, we present some maps to you as starter points for discussion, and then we take your feedback. We come back with an additional set of maps that we think more accurately reflects the discussion or what you've requested as a commission. And it is sort of this iterative process that kind of keeps going until we get to a point where the commission feels that they're at a place where they are comfortable with a draft map to present to the public.
Yeah, I think we certainly want to hear from the public if they have anyone out there listening. Y'all got maps. Let's see them. I do think I guess a question for you is, I mean, obviously, if you bring us maps, we have conversations, you iterate. If there are some of us nerds who want to share our own maps for part of the conversation to start with, what's the best way to do that, and what's the best time and place to do that?
I would suggest that they go to Sophia at the city, and then she can send them to us, and we're happy to look at them and incorporate them if at all possible. And so, but absolutely, if you have ideas, then I think they're hugely helpful. And I will say that in my experience, even I've worked with cities on some redistricting where community members have submitted maps that became the final map. And it really is, a great way to engage people and to see, to gain that input. So.
Yeah, there's nothing quite like having to grapple with the map itself and like recognizing that when you move a thing over here, it's going to affect the thing over there. And people have all kinds of big opinions until you go, but when you do that, that happens. And then.
Yes, it is often a series of trade-offs. So.
It's the whole game.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for the Flow Analytics team? Commissioner Lumley?
Thank you. One of the questions I've had is we have a geographic boundary of the Willamette River, and I was curious how many citizens are on the west side of the Willamette River, and compare that to the goal of 1/4 of the population. Does anybody have that information handy, or could we get that at the next meeting?
We can provide that at the next meeting.
Great, thank you.
It's definitely less than 25%.
Oh, it's less than, okay, well, that's interesting to know.
Yeah, I know
Thank you,
Multnomah
Commissioner.
County District 1 process is on both sides of the river for that reason.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I think I did see you share that link to the county map as well in the chat. Are there any other questions for the team at this point? For the Flow Analytics team at this point? Okay, so they'll be around, but we did want to start to have a discussion around district criteria and just start to gauge where your thinking is around potentially adding additional criteria. As a reminder, the next meeting will be, the next full meeting of the commission will be March 13th. At that meeting, which precedes the public hearing, where we will review the draft proposal, the March 13 meeting, you will need to adopt draft plan criteria. So we want to just start to see where you are on that process, because we will have to come to a decision in the next meeting. Commissioner Van Ness.
I don't think we're going to be ready to come to a decision at the next meeting. The maps that have been presented to us are very generic. We have a lot of data that we need, and respectfully, the commissioners have not had an opportunity to date to sit down and talk and debate and argue and figure this out. I feel like the agenda is setting us up for failure. And I would ask for, with the public observing, time for, without any outside input, for the commissioners to be able to sit down, get the data we need, and talk through these issues before we go to the next level.
Now, the plan criteria, so the next, just to be clear, the public hearing is about the draft plan criteria. So the decision point is not the maps themselves, but the criteria that will be used to draw the maps.
But we have not
numbers.
adopted that criteria as far as
No, you have not.
Right. So
that's the next
meeting.
meeting.
But that's going to require, respectfully, work groups. It's going to require us as a team to talk about these issues and share lived experiences, and not have an agenda or moderators. I mean, I think we're spending a lot of time on the exact opposite of what our job is here.
I do have to remind you that as public officials and then for this commission, your meetings are going to be public. So
That's
even the working
fine.
groups will be public. Okay, just wanted to
Of
note
course, but we haven't had a working group yet. We have not sat down together as a commission and discussed where we're coming from, how we see this. that we need this to be the focal point before we get any further. Otherwise, I'm not sure what the purpose is of me being here, frankly, because it seems like everything's been mapped out.
We can absolutely convene a working group ahead of the next meeting, and we can take volunteers for that group if there's broader interest in doing that in a small group. I'm going to move to Commissioner Valdani, followed by Commissioner Manjarres and Commissioner Weiss. Commissioner.
Hi, yeah, I just had a clarification question, and maybe this will help with the concern that Commissioner Van Ness brought up, because this is something that I've been confused about as well. When we establish our district criteria, maybe explain to me, so let's say we decide we really want to make sure we maintain school districts. We don't want to divide a school district. Does that have to be in our district criteria? Or can that just be something that we decide as a group we really want to pay attention to and only break a school district if we absolutely have to for a very good reason? So if you can clarify, it seems to me the district criteria are these overarching ideals of, contiguous, try to make sure it's a lump, right? Compact, make sure it's a lump. Whereas, or am I wrong? Is it more than just the big picture ideals? Is it really this specific stuff where we have to decide right now if we're going to pay attention to school district boundaries?
So I can take this response, or Kimmy, if you would like it, either one. Okay. So
go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. So the answer is no. So considering certain data does not have to be used as a specific criteria for the overall plan. I think Alex or Kimmy, you spoke to the different types of data that you can actually use to help guide your thinking, your analysis of the districts as they're shaping up. However, and also you can develop additional tools to help guide your decision making. I believe Commissioner Manjarres, you recommended one that actually had a statement of potential, like framing the analysis around values, right? And then using that as a way to align values and decision-making around the types of analysis you'll do, potentially with implications for the criteria or not. So the criteria themselves would be adopted. If they are adopted, you then have to design the maps to those specific criteria. Mm-hmm. However, there are other ways to assess and analyze the data to try to take other factors into account. And then, of course, there are certain limitations on how you can use other types of data, specifically race and ethnicity and language, that are restricted. Did I miss anything, Kimmy or Alex?
No, I think just a simple example of that is, one of the criteria is to use existing geographic or political boundaries. So there is data available to help you do that, like some of the things we've mentioned. You can look at school districts for that example and consider them, but we're not setting out on it with a new additional criteria that says we must not split any school districts. I think that's the distinction.
So I guess I would say, and I may not be framing this the right way, I move that the commission be given the opportunity to sit down together and start talking about this and the boundaries. And we need data that we don't have currently. Like the current maps that have been provided are very generic. I know many commissioners have asked for data. I think what makes sense in the next step is that the commissioners, start working on this.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Van Ness. I will ask that you raise your hand. We had a few commissioners waiting to weigh in. There was a motion to form a work group, I believe.
I think we all have to, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think this isn't a work group. I think this is what the core why we were appointed to begin with. I think the commission needs to get together and start working on what the task is.
So defining so we will focus on defining, getting agreement and consensus around the proposed draft criteria that does need to be presented to the public as required under measure 26-228. We can talk about additional sessions to help to foster that, additional information that we can request in the meantime, if there are specific requests around data or splits or potential criteria. So we can follow up around specific requests. If folks know kind of what they need ahead of like right now, that's great. We can get to work. We can have the flow team get to work on pulling that information and data, but they do need some guidance around what information to pull. You can also send that request to Sophia, who can also coordinate offline if you need additional time to think about it. Commissioner Manjarres.
Yes, thank you. I guess I'm going to give a pretty expansive comment. I want to start by saying I really appreciate the level set today, which is what I understood this really to be, in terms of recognizing that everybody in the conversation doesn't have access to the same information. And part of leveling access and accessibility is making sure that we're slowing down so that everybody has the information they need to understand even the scope of the conversation. And I think the charge that we're given was very clear in terms of what the ballot measure said, the application request. And so I actually do think process is really critical so that we can make sure that some folks aren't dominating the conversation and that we aren't just centering our own experiences. And I'll speak from my own experience to say that it's very easy for me to jump in and say, this is what I think, this is what I think, this is what I think. Here's what my neighborhood has said. But we're, as a small group coming together, really responsible to the needs of the entire city. And I think that process to hold ourselves accountable is really important, which is why we went through the process of establishing bylaws, which is why we have meeting agreements. That gives us all something to be accountable to, that it's not just to each other. And to be frank, I don't know many of the people in this group, so I'm not ready to sit and have a conversation with different folks without understanding what conversation I'm getting into. And I appreciate the facilitation, because I feel like it's been really setting the context for the conversation. So appreciate the level set, appreciate the information. I will say my understanding of the criteria, and this is why I think this is really important, and I do have experience myself having gone through redistricting and am an attorney with a focus on elections, so I'm very familiar in these areas. And criteria is going to tell us what data is relevant. And I think that's sort of where we get to that next level of request. So I think it's really critical to delineate, and I saw this in the memo that was provided to us, what criteria is required by law, right? What's required in our charge, what is not negotiable at this point, and just say it, right? This is not negotiable. This is what we were given. Constitutionally, this is what we have to consider. We have to use census data because we have a Voting Rights Act. We can't just make it all up. We can't do that. Because then we're just, we're going to, put this up we're going to go through all this work, and then it's going to be challenged, and we're going to be starting from scratch. And I think the public has put more trust in us than that. We don't want to waste public resources by not focusing and being intentional about the process we put in place in order to get to where we want to go, which is very difficult, right? So, and it's going to have points of tension. So criteria in my mind is, I think if we can in the next conversation, have complete clarity about what is legally required and what we're actually going to include, and just put that down and just get some clarity around that. And then what we can consider in addition to, and if there's something on the slide that folks want, and I heard one, somebody brought libraries up earlier, which I think is great. I love libraries, right? So I would consider that. So I think that's where we can focus then the conversation, where we're going to have differences on things we can actually change, right? And so I think that's, in my mind, what we're going to be focusing on next time. Once we get sort of those categories of criteria, then the staff and the team and the folks who are working really hard to pull together this information that is not easy to pull together can go and say, okay, well, here's the number of libraries, we just saw some population data. So all of the maps are just examples. None of the maps that we saw is anything that is even up for consideration right now. It's just to show what a map looks like, really. And so I think if we can just really focus, and maybe that's, and this is feedback for the facilitators, I think you're doing an incredible job, and I also have more information to work from. So I think that if we can just really be very specific about where we have decision points and where we're being asked very specifically to either add or subtract, understanding, again, there are some things that are just legally non-negotiable and some things that are. And if we have points of tension around things that are, then we can have a work group to say, hey, I don't want libraries to be included. That would not be me, but somebody maybe doesn't. And we want a space where folks who have differences of opinion there can then have a conversation offline. Again, coming back to the meeting agreements around respecting everybody's time, and that we want to make sure we're not here for 50 hours. I just think the process is going okay, but I can understand where it can be confusing because there is a lot of information to process. So if we can just really hone in when we're talking about criteria, where are we actually having decision points, and maybe like narrowing the scope of that. That said, there's going to be a lot of data coming in, and I think that's the public comment. And if there's a work group that can sift through reports or do something like that, that would be actually really valuable, but I think that's not necessarily a full group conversation, right? So to Commissioner Van Ness, I hear you. I feel like, I'm like, let's eyes on the prize, let's get there. And I will say, in a diverse group like this with folks who have varying levels of experience, sometimes we have to slow down so that we don't get ahead of ourselves and folks feel like they weren't following along in the process, or that the public wasn't able to track where decision points were happening.
Thank you, Commissioner Manjarres. And we've also noted the feedback as well. So for comment, I have Commissioner Wise, Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins, Commissioner Baldini. Can you give me a nod of the head if you're good at this point with no comment? Okay, great. So we'll have Commissioner Wise, Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins, and Commissioner Lumley.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I have some similar comments. There's a saying where we actually have to move slow to move fast. And I think this is a perfect example of that. Like in my role in, I guess, the advocacy realm, and in interacting with the maps at the state level, I can tell you that it took community groups and experts in the community months to get a handle on what this process and what this data actually means, and for folks to get to the point where they could articulate that back to their communities in a meaningful way and get that feedback back to the legislature. Okay, so just know that it like the groundwork to actually get to some of these communities is very difficult, and we really need these processes in order to make sure that we have a strong foundation. With that being said, it is my opinion that the work plan that we actually have is aggressive based on the timeline that we have in order to achieve our work. With that being said, I think it's a good plan. We kind of have to do it, and at the same time, I just want to put that out there. Like it takes a very long time to make sure that folks are on the same page. With that being said, it is also my understanding that we have not actually seen maps yet that will contribute to our final project. I believe the maps that we saw today were for examples or for informational purposes. You should let me know if I'm wrong there, but that's how I'm taking in the information and just making sure that we are able to have that foundational, I guess, set of data and also information so that we could start to look at the criteria and our engagement plan, and so forth. So I just wanted to make that clear from my end. Like, that's how I'm kind of viewing our time together so far. And that, I just want to reiterate, like, the amount of effort and time that it takes to actually make sure that folks who may not speak English, like folks who don't have the resources always to be at these meetings, the effort that it takes to make sure that we are bringing people along. So it just, to my fellow commissioners, strap in, because I think it's important that we do this right.
Thank you, Commissioner. As a point of clarification, you are absolutely right. The maps you've seen are illustrative. So for instance, total population or an overlay of certain data points. And then the exercise around the breakout for districts 1, 2, 3, 4, those were just purely examples to show the variance, the level of variance. But they were not proposed, or they were just to show how sticking to the 5 to 10% maximum would actually work from a mathematical perspective. So you were right on that point. So Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins, Commissioner Lumley, and Commissioner Judd. And then I would invite any other final comments as we move towards the end of this, discussion. Commissioner Saxena, I know that you did weigh in a bit, but I wanted to invite you if you had any final thoughts. And Commissioner Lorente, if you also had any thoughts, wanted to invite those as well. So Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I really appreciate this conversation that we're having. And I have been struggling with the criteria that were in the measure, and some of them do seem non-negotiable. And I think it's really important that we understand and we help the public understand which of those are non-negotiable that we have to live with. And I think the one area that has a lot of promise for these conversations is in this third criteria about not dividing communities of common interest, because communities of common interest is where all of those questions that we're going to ask in this first set of public comment and public hearing, we get to learn a lot about how people in Portland view communities of common interest. What are their communities of common interest? They may be quite different from mine or anyone else who's on the commission. And then once we have that, once we get a better handle on that, then we can build maps and figure out if data exists for being able to overlay those communities of common interest and the data associated with that on maps. It seems like we just have to start where we're at, which is not at data, but at what these criteria are and how we're going to get community buy-in for those criteria.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Lumley, and then Commissioner Judd.
Well said, Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins. That's pretty much what I was going to say, that we're here really as a starting point with the criteria that's in the charter and proposing perhaps additional criteria for public comment or not. And that decision is going to be made at the next meeting, and it goes out to public comment. And then we receive comment and come back and as a group decide on the criteria. But the question before us at this particular meeting is not to start drawing maps or looking at data. It's really just to come to some decision on what kind of criteria we're going to present to the public and then receive that information. And then that is really the first big step that we have to take as a commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Commissioner Judd, I think you'll have the final comment if there, yeah, probably with time.
Which is ironic because I'm not going to mention anything about the criteria. But I'm not a statistician, but I like to play with them. And what they've taught me is that the metadata is important. So if we could, when we do get to the data, not now, when we do get the data, if we could reference the level of the bias in each one of the data sets, how they relate to one another, in terms of bias and also in terms of when it was collected and by whom. That metadata would be important. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, we've got a note of that. Thank you. So on the district criteria, and I did want to just bring a finer point to that to multiple comments. The decision point in the next meeting really is this decision around what, at least from a draft perspective, before the comment period, how does the commission want to approach the criteria for developing the plan? Just to be clear, that is what we'll walk away from the March 13 meeting with a decision on that point. Commissioner Manjarrez and then Commissioner Sexton. Commissioner Sexton and then Commissioner Chisholm.
I just have a clarifying question. So for the not dividing communities of interest, is there, so I've always heard it as preserving communities of interest, which in my mind is the more affirmative decision around what communities of interest you want to preserve. That's a little bit different than not dividing communities of interest, which is, they're a little bit different. So I'm curious if we're tied to one and if we would consider maybe moving it to the other. But again, if it's what we're given and is a non-negotiable, I would just like to have clarity around that.
I actually asked that question of Paul Mitchell last time. Is there a difference? And he said there was not. I'm not sure that's correct. And I'm trying to remember.
I think from a
where
decision-making
about the
standpoint,
difference.
there's a difference. Yeah.
So I think this is a question we can direct to the city attorney's office as a specific distinction. Thank you for flagging it. Commissioner Saxena.
Yeah, no, and I was, I appreciate that distinction because it does feel different to me, preserving communities of common interest. And I was also thinking that, you know, not everything we consider is a criteria. So for example, communities of common interest, that's a criteria, but then we're going to make decisions about what those are. And that is a whole other kind of complicated conversation about what are communities of common interest. And things like libraries and parks aren't necessarily criteria, but they're data points. So there's going to be a whole bunch of other decision-making factors, even once we decide what are the criteria, even if we just stay with the criteria that are in the charter amendment, we still have a whole bunch of other decision points around, you know, what do the criteria mean, and then what data points do we consider? So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Chisholm, was that a lowered hand? Okay, so we will wrap then with Commissioner Van Ness, and then we will discuss just next steps.
So I think data points to some extent are irrelevant in the big picture of what our task is. And so again, I would ask that the entire commission have an opportunity to sit down together and talk about all of this with blown up maps and the data that we are entitled to, so that we can figure out what makes sense as far as common interest areas. And that's all in there.
And you will have those opportunities if, you know, to define common interest and to just wrestle with what that means in the context of the maps following the establishment of the criteria themselves.
Respectfully, I mean, this is what we should be starting on now. I mean, I keep getting emails and messages that we have to have this vote by September 1st. So why aren't we starting to work together as a commission now?
With all due respect, and evaluate maps going forward. This body is required by law to draft that criteria, to engage the public around it, and to use, and then to adopt criteria and to use those criteria to start evaluating maps.
So can we agree that moving forward, we're going to focus on that?
That absolutely is the focus of the work, and developing them and establishing the initial maps is slated to begin in April. But those initial criteria must be defined to begin the assessment of potential maps and variations. That is the meat and the core responsibility of this group. But doing it in a way that is in
Well, that-
line with.
I'm going to
but
push
doing it in
back a little bit on that. That's not the core responsibility of this group. The core responsibility of this group is to take what the voters of Portland voted for and create 4 voting districts starting 2024. That's what the mission of this group is.
So you did not actually let me finish my statement, so I will finish it now. The core responsibility of this group is to establish draft plans that are in accordance with Measure 26-228, which was passed by voters. To do it in a way that is legally compliant, but also in a way that is responsive to community outreach and engagement, which is also a shared agreement that this team has already adopted as the way it wants to approach the core work of proposing and ultimately approving those districts. So I will take the last comment from Commissioner Baldini, but then we will have to adjourn the meeting after reviewing next step.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I want to acknowledge, of course, the pressure that we're all feeling to do this quickly and to do it right. And, you know, I think we're all feeling that. For me, during this meeting, it really helped me to understand the process, thinking more, and please correct me if this is wrong, as the district criteria, almost as similar to a value set, you know, a big picture idea of what we're going to try to do. And then the actual data that we use to fulfill those values, if you will, we can decide that later, and we should, right? We should, after months of hearing from the community, that's what we can use to figure out exactly those data points and what we want to use. But at this stage, we're just thinking big picture value. And that's why the consultant is like, you know, try not to get too specific here. This is big picture. Don't fence yourself in too much, because you're going to learn so much from the community as this process goes forward. So that distinction in my head helped make me feel better about where we are in this process and next steps. So I don't know if that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you to all of the commissioners today for all the input, not just on your foundational documents, but also guiding the discussion around establishing those criteria and arriving at agreement and consensus with how it'll guide your work in the coming months. Adam, do you mind just bringing up the final slide before we adjourn? So we've talked about this next step, but I did want to formalize it. The next meeting is scheduled for Monday, March 13th from 6 to 9 p.m. In that meeting, as we've discussed, the primary decision point will be around the draft criteria, establishing that, and that will be the precursor to opening the period, formally opening the period of public comment related to the draft criteria, following that up with a public hearing to hear comment, and then concluding the comment period. I think it's about a week after. So it won't be the only opportunity for the public, as we've discussed, to provide input and to provide comment, but that is a designated window where we expect to see very specific comments related to the draft criteria. But again, it's not the only method. It's not the only mechanism. You're not bound to just have that. There should be other opportunities to engage meaningfully in line with the values you've adopted. Okay. We do have a few items to follow up with the city attorney, so we were getting those. We have a few edits to make to the values document. We'll be recirculating and soliciting your feedback and input around the community engagement plan. We would look to adopt that, a version of that, in the coming meeting. So just if you do have that feedback, we would definitely take it ahead of the meeting. But we can also discuss and finalize in the upcoming one. So those are the two primary decision points. I'm going to try to be more clear about what we'll be focusing on. going forward. And if there are no comments before we adjourn, seeing none, we are adjourned.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much,
for
everyone.
facilitating.
You are welcome. Thank you, everyone.